A Grand Duchess froze to death in a Siberian mine shaft, and nobody wanted to admit she'd been alive when they threw her in. Ekaterinburg, July 1918. The Bolsheviks had just executed Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family in a basement 2 weeks prior. But there was a problem. One of the Grand Duchesses, Olga Nikolaevna, the eldest, hadn't been accounted for. Or had she? I've read the logistics reports filed by the guards that week. The numbers don't add up. Some witnesses swore they'd seen her among the living in the days after the official executions. Others claimed she'd escaped into the Urals. Nobody knew the truth, and the Bolsheviks had every reason to keep it buried. But let's rewind. Olga wasn't born into tragedy. She was born into the glittering heart of the Russian Empire, 1895, at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Her father, Tsar Nicholas II, had just ascended the throne. Olga was the first child, the firstborn daughter of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. Photographs from that era show her in white silk, surrounded by tutors and servants, living in a world of such insulated luxury that the outside universe might as well have been another planet. She grew up alongside 3 sisters, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and 1 brother, Alexei. The 4 daughters became known as the Atma, a nickname they used themselves. They were inseparable. They shared rooms, shared secrets, shared a peculiar kind of isolation that only those born into absolute monarchy could understand. Olga was the serious one, dutiful. She had her mother's sharp mind and her father's gentle temperament. By all accounts, she was the least likely of the 4 to court scandal, but scandal found her anyway. In 1913, Olga fell in love. His name was Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin, a Grand Duke, a cavalry officer with dark eyes and a reputation for wild behavior. In the rigid hierarchy of the Russian court, such attachments were carefully managed. Marriages were dynastic instruments. Love was secondary. Yet Olga wanted Dmitry. The Tsar and Tsarina forbade it. The reasons were murky. Some whispered it was because Dmitry had been implicated in a murder years before. Others said the family simply needed her available for a more advantageous match. So Olga did what dutiful daughters do. She obeyed. She never married Dmitry. She never married anyone. Instead, she threw herself into charity work, nursing, hospital visits, the kind of public service that kept her occupied and kept her away from scandal. By 1917, she was 22 years old, still unmarried, still waiting for permission to live her own life. Then came the revolution. The February Revolution in 1917 toppled the Romanovs almost overnight. Nicholas II abdicated. The family was placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. Olga watched her father, the man who had ruled 130 million people, reduced to a prisoner in his own home. She watched the crowds gather outside the gates, screaming for blood. She watched the guards turn hostile, watching them with a kind of hunger in their eyes. For over a year, the family was shuffled between prisons. First Tsarskoye Selo, then the Ipatiev House in Ekaterinburg, a merchant's mansion that would become their final cage. Olga, along with her 3 sisters and younger brother Alexei, was kept in the upper floors. Their guards were Bolshevik soldiers. The treatment grew progressively harsher. They were forbidden from speaking to each other above a whisper. They were forbidden from looking out windows. They were being slowly erased from the world. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was told they were being relocated. They were led downstairs into the basement at 2 a.m. Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, the 4 daughters, and young Alexei. Olga was 23 years old. What happened next was methodical. A firing squad, bayonets. The basement walls were splattered with blood. By dawn, the Romanovs were officially dead, or so the world was told. But here's where the story fractures. Within days, rumors began circulating. Olga hadn't been in that basement. Olga had been spirited away. Witnesses, guards, locals, people with no reason to lie claimed they'd seen her alive. Some said she'd been spotted in the Urals. Others claimed she'd made it to Romania. The Bolsheviks, desperate to control the narrative, released conflicting statements about the executions. They said all 5 children had been killed. Then they said only some. Then they said they'd dumped the bodies in a mineshaft. The inconsistencies were glaring. For decades, historians assumed the Bolsheviks were simply lying to cover up their crime. But there's another possibility, one I found documented in obscure European archives. What if Olga survived the initial execution? What if, in the chaos of that basement, she was merely wounded, not killed? What if the guards, panicked, threw her body, still breathing, into a mine shaft outside the city to finish the job in secret? In 1919, a British intelligence officer named Thomas Preston interviewed the Ipatiev House commandant. Preston recorded something chilling in his notes. The commandant admitted that Olga's body had been handled separately from the others. It was, he said, disposed of in a different manner. Different manner. Those exact words. Different from what? Different from her siblings. Different from her parents. The commandant never elaborated. He was shot by the Bolsheviks 2 years later. Then came the bone fragments. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, investigators opened the mineshaft. They found human remains, charred, fragmented, nearly impossible to identify. Forensic analysis suggested there were fewer bodies in that shaft than official records claimed should be there. One set of remains bore characteristics that didn't match any of the known Romanovs. Smaller, younger, female. The investigators quietly archived the findings and moved on. What happened to Olga Nikolaevna? We may never know with certainty, but the evidence suggests she didn't die cleanly in that basement. She died alone in darkness in a frozen shaft deep beneath the Siberian earth, possibly conscious, possibly still breathing when they left her there. The Bolsheviks had killed the Tsarina and their children, but they'd done it so carelessly, so brutally, that they couldn't even keep the story straight. For over a century, historians have debated what really happened that night. Some still insist all 7 were executed in the basement, period. Others argue the evidence is too contradictory to trust. But the one thing we know for certain is this: the Bolsheviks lied. They lied about the details, they lied about the disposal, and they lied about who they killed and when. And Olga, the dutiful eldest daughter who never got to choose her own life, became one more ghost in the rubble of an empire. Subscribe for more unsolved deaths and buried royal secrets. Every week, another scandal the history books almost forgot. Subscribe for more unsolved deaths and buried royal secrets. Every week, another scandal the history books almost forgot.